Hi, good evening, and welcome to our series, Jewish Life is Waking Up, where we're talking to different scholars, activists, and thinkers from around the globe who are seeing different pieces of the Jewish world and responding in this moment. I'm here with Rabbi Ed Feinstein, my friend and teacher. And today we're really blessed to be here with Rabbi Jill Jacobs, an author, a scholar, activist, and executive director of Trua, a rabbinic organization for human rights. And Jill, I've been really interested in this moment to ask you. There's so much going on in the national conversation about different forms of activism, and so many times. Many people I meet will put religion or spirituality in one bucket and political activism or social justice in a separate bucket. And you've, throughout many years, found a way to lead in both ways and intertwine them, I feel. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how you see those two pieces, if you see them together, how they work together.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much to Rabbi Kushner and Rabbi Feinstein for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be here in conversation with you. When we think about the division between ritual and what we call social justice, it's a totally artificial distinction in Judaism. So even if we think about, just to begin with the Torah, when we think about the Torah, we have many parshiot, many Torah portions where we have really side by side laws that have to do with rituals and laws that have to do with how to build a society that functions and is just for everybody. And that's how Judaism is built. So when we think about halacha, which is usually translated as Jewish law, it really comes from the word lalechet, to walk. So it's a way of walking in the world. And the way that we walk in the world isn't just about what we do or don't do on Shabbat, or what we do and don't eat, or how we pray, though those are also important parts of Judaism, of course. I don't want to disparage ritual at all, but halacha also includes many, many laws about how we are supposed to build a society that is a good place for all of us to live. So we have an entire section of Jewish law, of codified Jewish law, that is called Choshen Mishpat, which is about civil law, which is about everything from the relationships between landlords and tenants, the relationships between employers and employees. We have, of course, laws about Tzedaka. Actually, they live in a different section, but we have laws about Tzedaka. And in all of it, we have very smart religious leaders throughout centuries and millennia trying to answer the question of how are we all supposed to live together in a way that everybody can get their basic needs met, that everybody can live as a creation b'tselem Elohim, that everybody can have the dignity that all of us have as human beings. And so in Judaism, it's very much integrated, but for lots of historical and other reasons, somehow many of us have inherited this sense that being religious is about the rituals. So when people say things like, I'll say, I'm sure that as a rabbi, you've also heard this, that you meet somebody for the first time and you say that you're a rabbi and they start confessing, right? And it's like, I'm so sorry, I didn't fast on Yom Kippur and I eat bacon and I haven't been to synagogue since my bar bat mitzvah, right? It's like they say all those things. But in my experience, at least, nobody has ever said, I'm so sorry, but I don't give tzedakah, or I'm so sorry, but I am an employer and I stole wages from my employees. I've never heard somebody say that. Now, not that I'm hoping that's because they didn't actually do those things, but somehow we've inherited that sense of what it means to be a good Jew is just to do the ritual, but actually for Judaism, it's all completely integrated, and halacha covers all of those areas.
One of the critiques that you read in the press, the Jewish press, you hear a polarization. People from one side of the community turn to the other side of the community and say, you're only concerned with the internal life of the Jewish people. You've forgotten our responsibility to the world. And from the other side, you hear, you're only concerned with tikkun olam. You've reduced Judaism to tikkun olam. That's, I think, the language that's used. and you've forgotten to protect the inner life of the Jewish people. You're not advocating for the future, the security, the well-being of the Jewish people. So when you hear that stuff, I'm sure it makes you really uncomfortable. It certainly makes me feel uncomfortable. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, it's a false dichotomy. So even taking the question of what makes Jews safe, well, when you look at how Jews vote, most Jews vote on issues like healthcare. And right, because we all know that many of us are just one step or a couple paychecks or one job away from losing our healthcare. And of course, we know the dire consequences of that. Right? So what keeps Jews safe in this country is having access to healthcare. Now, it happens that also keeps everybody safe. And when we think about public schools, for example, some people might make the choice to send their own kids to day schools, but public schools are not just about educating our kids. Lots of people don't have kids in public schools. Their kids are grown up, their kids are too young, whatever it is. But public schools are also about educating our neighbors and our bosses and employees and the police officers and the firefighters and our government officials and right, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we ask the question, what keeps us safe? Well, good education is not just about our own kids. If we have kids, it's also about all of our society, right? And we can use that example for everything in our society. And I'll say also, having a strong functioning democracy that protects individual rights and that protects religious liberties keeps Jews safe. And we've certainly understood throughout history, Jews have had a lot of experiences, unfortunately, in living under governments that do not keep us safe, governments that are not concerned with individual liberties, governments that are tyrannies, governments that use us as scapegoats. And so creating systems of government, with democracy being the best one that we have, at least as of now, but creating a democratic government and ensuring democracy means that Jews are going to be safer in our society. And that is certainly not at odds with creating a strong Jewish community. So for me as a rabbi and a conservative rabbi, so I am very deeply invested in ritual and I do live my life within the parameters of halakha. I don't see any conflict between, for example, investing in Jewish education, investing in Jewish life, living a life where I go totally offline for 25 hours a week, for example. There's absolutely no conflict between that and also investing in the broader society, which is a way of keeping Jews safe as well as keeping others safe.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about Trua and the work of Trua and the direction that it's going, especially
Absolutely.
in this polarizing moment? Yeah.
Yeah. Trua is an organization that was founded in 2002. I've been the executive director for almost 10 years, so since 2011. And we were founded as a way to elevate the moral voices of rabbis and cantors as religious leaders. And to make the point, this goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, but to make the point that the job of a religious leader isn't just to lead ritual and life cycle, et cetera, though that is crucially important. It's also to be a moral leader in our society. And so Trua organizes right now more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors across the United States and Canada to bring that moral voice to protecting human rights, both here at home where we live, so either in the US or Canada, depending where we happen to be, and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, because of course, as rabbis and as Jews, we have deep connections to Israel, and we also have a strong responsibility to make that place live up to the human rights ideals that we would all like to live up to. So the way that Trua works is that we organize, as I said, our network of more than 2,000 rabbi and cantor members to work with their communities, so both as individuals and also with their communities on specific issues where we think that the Jewish community can make an impact. So in the United States, we primarily work on issues of immigration, of incarceration, especially solitary confinement, and on issues of slavery, trafficking in the labor system and workers' rights. In Israel, we're committed to the human rights of both Israelis and Palestinians, which includes the right to citizenship somewhere, everybody has the right to citizenship in a country, not in any country, but in a country, and the right to self-determination. So we support a two-state solution, which we think is the best way to guarantee the human rights, including self-determination and citizenship of both Israelis and Palestinians. So that's one of the ways we work, is by organizing around very specific campaigns. And I can give some examples as we go on. The second piece is that we train rabbis and rabbinical students to be human rights leaders. So for example, we have a program in Israel during the year that rabbinical students spend there. That's a required part of the rabbinical school experience for most rabbinical schools, at least the non-Orthodox rabbinical schools. So during the year that the students spend in Israel, we take them to see human rights issues on the ground. So we'll take them to pick olives or to plant olive trees with Palestinians in the West Bank. We take them to meet Bedouin Israeli leaders in the Negev who are fighting to protect their homes. We'll take them to meet with Israeli activists, Israeli human rights and civil society leaders, Palestinian civil society leaders, so that they get a broader picture of what's happening vis-a-vis human rights in Israel. And then we work with them so that they're able to come home, even still as students working in a student pulpit or teaching Hebrew school, and be able to have complicated conversations and to teach from that moral perspective about what they've seen in Israel. And then we also amplify the voices of rabbis and cantors as human rights leaders. As I mentioned, the idea that we want to break apart this idea that what it means to be a religious leader is just to take care of the ritual needs.
I'm curious about your own journey to this. I'm also a graduate of JTS.
Mm-hmm.
I was there during the Jurassic Age. And during that time, not only was human rights, political activity frowned upon, excluded from the whole life of the seminary, but even work in the community. I mean, I was out teaching, and that was considered a waste of time. I should have been sitting in front of books, ancient books. So where did you come by this, and how did you get into this kind of work? And the other question is, you look outside at the political landscape, and it's enough to destroy anyone's faith. Where do you find inspiration in this work?
Sure. Well, when I was at JTS in the late 90s, early 2000s, social justice was also not really part of the discourse. Now, thankfully, that has very much changed. And so for me, I had gone to Columbia undergraduate, which is only 6 blocks away from JTS, and then took a year off, but still in that general neighborhood. So I had been in the neighborhood for a bunch of years by the time I started at JTS. And so I realized that I thought that I knew the neighborhood, and yet the thing that I had always been told when I got to Columbia in 1993 as a first year, they said to us, don't go above 125th Street and don't go east of Morningside Park. And being a kid from the suburbs, I just kind of did what I was told, and didn't really ask that many questions until I had been there for a few years and started thinking, well, why? Why do I keep being told not to go farther north than really just 3 blocks north of JTS, or farther east than the building? And I decided that if I was going to be there for another 5 years as a rabbinical student, that I better get to know the neighborhood. And so I found an organization that at the time was working on a particular housing issue that had come up in the late 90s as the city was selling off about 10,000 buildings that had defaulted to city ownership in the 70s and 80s, and people were getting moved around, and all sorts of challenging situations were happening for the tenants. And so I started getting involved in this organization, and I would walk from JTS, which, if you know New York, is on 122nd and Broadway, to 123rd and Adam Clayton Powell. So it was about a 10-minute walk. And when I would tell people at JTS that I was going to this organization that was based there, they would say to me, are you sure that's safe? I mean, it's Harlem. And I would say, well, we're in Harlem, actually. And when I would go to the other part of Harlem, people would say, wow, you're the first Jew I've ever met who's not a slumlord, which was just really deeply painful. And the fact that in 10 minutes I could walk through these different worlds was just very challenging. And I didn't want to live this kind of existence where it was just bifurcated, where I couldn't talk to people 10 minutes over here about what was going on 10 minutes over there. And so I actually went back to those ancient books and I said, I wonder if anybody ever said anything about housing. And I mean, I really had no idea. And I found myself very quickly on in a sugya, in a section of Talmud that was talking, that had to do with what responsibilities landlords have toward their tenants and what repairs the landlords have to do and what repairs the tenants have to do and when you're allowed to evict somebody and when you're not. And it was like what I was seeing in Harlem was just coming to alive in these pages, but it was from 1500 years before. And it suddenly, I mean, this is something that is just not news to anybody who's coming through rabbinical school now. But for me, it was such news that these ancient books were actually speaking to the current moment and that they had a lot to say about issues of justice. And so for me, I started reading and learning more and writing and trying to figure out what it would mean to put together a rabbinate that brought these pieces together. And I can't even say it brought them together because they were together. I just didn't know about it, but that brought alive this strong justice tradition of Judaism. And like I said, now it's not even, it's just obvious. I hear from rabbinical students all the time who say, well, I want to talk about the social justice rabbinate because now it's an actual field. Whereas when I was just, I mean, not even 20 years ago, it was something that nobody was talking about, at least at JTS. I think it might have been different in other seminaries. And then in terms of how I keep hope alive, I mean, the Jewish people have been through a lot in the last couple thousand years, and this is not the worst of it. And so I just keep thinking about, I mean, even in this year of Zoom services and or, you know, for my family, we don't use Zoom on Shabbat. So there's small outdoor services at our synagogue, but you know, just this year of not being able to come together the way that we've always come together. I think about the Jews throughout history who couldn't even pray publicly or even couldn't pray privately and would have to hide it. And I mean, Jews have been through all sorts of different situations and have always held on to this hope that we're somehow moving toward a messianic era, even if it feels like it's a step back and it's a step forward and 6 steps back. And so I just really hold on to that sense of being part of the long, long, long arc of Jewish history. And maybe the last thing I'll say on that is that Jewish history is not linear. Like history normally is linear, but we sit around our Pesach tables at our Seder tables every year and we say, I came out of Egypt. It's not even like I'm just play acting that I came out of Egypt. We're actually saying it because we have a sense that it's happening in that moment again, and we're re-experiencing it again. And so I just think about the ways that Jewish history is just layered on itself and that we're always living in multiple layers of Jewish history. So this is maybe a difficult moment, but you know, I want to believe that we're part of a longer process that will head in the right direction.
Thank you. And I wonder, given all of this, if there is a theology or a theologian or a text, an image of God that is part of your internal vocabulary as you're leading in this work.
Yeah, I mean, I go back, this is not surprising at all, but I always go back to Heschel, who still has the most beautiful words that anybody has written about what it means to be a Jew who's committed to bringing about justice in the world, and thinking about his concept of divine pathos, the idea that God is that God is so directly connected to what is happening here, and that our responsibility as human beings is to respond to that, and that we're really called to a human response to God's just very deep emotion about all of the things that are going wrong here on earth, and to really thinking about all of the work that we do as that response.
So let me ask you a harder question to follow that one. When Heschel was working with Martin Luther King, they had a bond, a very personal bond, as well as a communal bond.
Mm-hmm.
But something happened after King's death, the Black Power movement pushed Jews basically out of the movement in order to assert their own authority, their own place in the world. And since then, African American communities and Jewish communities have had, that's what I call it, an ambivalent relationship. Certainly this last year, when we've seen all of the uprisings around Black Lives Matter, there's a tremendous support for that, I think, within the Jewish community. And at the same time, there's a certain amount of suspicion about certain notes and tropes of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel stuff that the themes that find its way into the discourse of the Black Lives Matter movement. So help us understand where we as a Jewish community should be in that kind of complex conversation of rights and change and racial justice in this country.
And I just have to jump in because Mark Dollinger is one of my closest friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he studied the Black and Jewish communal relationship, and some of it also, even the narrative that you began with, is now hotly contested, right? And so there were many Jews who were in favor of civil rights and many who weren't. It was a complicated, even the beginning is not as linear as maybe we would think about it. And I think some of that even plays into how we see this movement today.
I'm so glad you said that, because the first thing I was going to say is that this is really Mark Dollinger's book, and I don't know if you're having him as part of this series or, but I would just recommend that everybody go and read that book, because he really does go very deep into what exactly happened and what the different relationships were, and actually how the Jewish community was supporting the Black Power movement in the beginning, and the ways in which each was taking it. The other is sometimes Judaism really looked to the Black Power movement even as an inspiration. And so there's a lot there to unpack. And, and Heschel, as we know, was not necessarily, did not necessarily have a lot of followers from JTS and the conservative movement back in the day. There were obviously some, but I think sometimes we want to imagine how we would have acted if we were back in history, or think of things as much simpler 50 years ago. And everything is always complicated. It's always been complicated, and including today. And I should also just note that a lot of times the shorthand of the Jewish community, the Black community, obviously there's a whole bunch of overlap between the two. So I don't want to not say that. So I'll just say about Black Lives Matter in particular, because that has been, as you said, a topic of much conversation over the last bunch of years, both inside and obviously outside of the Jewish community. So first, it should not be an issue for anybody to say Black Lives Matter. Like, that should just be muvan me'elav. It should be completely and totally obvious that Black Lives Matter, that every single human being is created in the image of God and deserves to be treated like an image of God. And that means protection from physical harm, as well as being able to live a life of dignity. And we unfortunately live in a society where we have really every week, if not every day, examples of people of color who are being killed by police, or other examples of structural racism, the targeting of Black and brown people by law enforcement, the larger percentage of people of color who are in prison, for example, even for offenses that maybe drug offenses, other offenses that white people might not be arrested for. Right? So we have a million examples of structural racism in our society, and we as a Jewish community, as an American community, have a responsibility to try to undo that structural racism that our country has been built on for at least 400 years. Even more if we want to talk about also about Native Americans. So when I think about coalition work, so that's just kind of the preamble to say that when people are out on the street protesting police killings, when people are out on the street with Black Lives Matter banners, what the number one issue that is in people's mind is what I just said, that killings by police, structural racism, etc. Israel, most people are not out on the street because of Israel, but of course, Israel Palestine is a topic in general in this country on the left. And when I think about coalition work and when I think about getting involved in issues, something that is almost always true about coalition work is that we have to work in coalition with people with whom we agree on the issue we're working on, and we might not agree on other issues. So that could include, for us, it sometimes means working with religious communities, religious institutions on issues like solitary confinement, where we completely and totally disagree with them on issues of LGBTQ rights, for example, or reproductive rights, and might end up on the opposite side on those issues. And when we talk about, Black Lives Matter is not an organization. It's a slogan, it's a principle, and there's of course many organizations that are in the network. Some of whom have Israel Palestine positions, some of which don't. And sure, so we might disagree, sometimes even vehemently, with some of those groups. But when we're working on structural racism in America, our commitment to that shouldn't depend on everybody passing a test on Israel. And I'd say that when the Jewish community shows up, then we're able to have those hard conversations. I know that I personally have had many hard conversations with our partner organizations where something will come up about Israel-Palestine, and I'll say, well, this is how I see it, this is where I stand. And we have these conversations that are not public, that are just on the phone or on Zoom these days, or once upon a time in person, where we can hear each other. It doesn't mean we necessarily come out agreeing, but we're able to hear each other. And that's much more effective than publishing warring op-eds about how we can't possibly support Black Lives Matter because this platform said this thing or this group said this thing.
And I think I love the way that you frame that, and I'm wondering, in this and I think we're having a conversation about particularism and universalism, right? And we're pulled in different directions at different moments. What are the places in which I feel like your work is the most misunderstood within the Jewish community? And what are the places that you feel you can't believe? You started to speak to this earlier, but in terms of trajectories of growth, can you paint a little more of a picture for us about where you think, if there is a social justice rabbi, what does that look like, in the future?
Sure. So I'll start with the second question. I think every rabbi should be a social justice rabbi. It doesn't mean that you have a job at a social justice organization. And it would be bad if all rabbis were working at social justice organizations, because we need rabbis in synagogues and camps and schools and hospitals and everywhere else. I think that what it means to be a social justice rabbi is to come in with that sense that it's all interconnected. It's not like there's social justice Judaism and there's ritual Judaism, but let's always be in a conversation about what is going on in our community. How do we understand the issues around us? How do we want to participate in the issues around us? That our synagogues shouldn't be like fortresses that are closed off from the outside world, but how do we want to be part of the community in which we live and pray and study? And so that should always be part of our rabbinate. And in terms of, and I also think that ritual is really crucial for social justice, that both in terms of ritualizing moments, so whether that's about prayer or a ritual practice that happens at actions or at meetings, whether it's about bringing Torah in, so to teach a little bit of Torah that helps us to understand our justice work better, or whether it's about even talking about Shabbat. When we think about Shabbat, it's kind of the first pro-worker intervention to say that there's one day a week that we're not going to work. And I think part of the message that God gives us there is that sometimes it feels like if we just worked for one more day, we would solve everything. I've certainly had that experience in activist communities. It's like, if I could just work 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, like if I could get more done. it's kind of there's a lot of hubris there, the sense that like I could solve it if I just had a few more hours. And it's like God just shutting us down, saying, you know what, that your one extra day is probably not going to matter. I mean, yes, if you're like an emergency room doctor or somebody who's going to have a direct effect, a firefighter, right? But in terms of, for most of us, both we need that one day in order to sustain the work that we do in following days, but also it's to remind us that God didn't manage to finish the world in 6 days. And so God left many things undone. And so we are also not going to be able to fix the world and or finish anything, even if we had that 7th day. So really being able to see that there's no that there's not a barrier between our ritual lives and our justice activist lives, and bringing that into the DNA of every single institution that we build. Okay, now I've forgotten your first question, so maybe you want to ask it again.
I had just said, what's the biggest misconception about your work?
Sure. Well, so Trua, as I mentioned, half of our work is on US-Canada issues and half of our work is on Israel issues. And because there is such a dichotomy in how we think about Israel, I mean, again, a false dichotomy, as many of them, most dichotomies are, there's a sense that either you're pro-Israel or you're pro-Palestinian. Either you believe that Israel has the right to exist, or you believe that Israel should just disappear and all the 6 million Jews who live there should also go somewhere else, right? Like that's just false. And it makes it very difficult often in our community to have real conversations about Israel. And so particularly from the right, people will say, well, Trua, aren't you pro-BDS? Now, we're not. We don't support BDS, but just the fact that people have put that marker on it, right? One could decide that BDS was the right strategy, but not think, as most people don't think, that all of the Jews in Israel should just disappear. Right? And so being able to talk about, for us, we're a human rights organization. So we start not from the political solution, but we start from the human rights. And we say, everybody who is living in that piece of land has basic human rights, just like everybody on this planet. And you get human rights by virtue of being human, not by anything that you do, not by living under a good government, not by, right? You get human rights because you're human. And as I mentioned, some of those human rights include the right to citizenship, the right to self-determination. There's obviously a lot of international law that has to do with the laws of occupation. But sometimes in the Jewish community, as soon as you say words like occupation or human rights, people want to shove you into you're anti-Israel, which we are absolutely not anti-Israel. We work very closely with Israeli human rights organizations, and we're certainly committed, as I said, to the human rights of everybody in that piece of land. But unfortunately, that sense of that kind of black and white sense in our community makes it hard to have those conversations that are thicker and more nuanced than that.
Actually, I want to extend the other part of because I want you to help me answer somebody, because everybody has a nephew or a niece or a kid who sits at the table and says, listen, I work for social justice. I work for all of these causes. What does Jewish add to it? Mm-hmm. So you've talked about where social justice comes out of your study of the text. I want you to turn the other way around. What does Jewish contribute to social justice activism, which is an advantage, is something, a value added to a less rooted or a less studied social justice agenda?
Sure. So I'll say 3 things. One is text, one is ritual, and one is community. I've kind of talked a little bit about all of those, but Jewish texts, we have thousands of years of very smart people arguing with each other, including about how to create a more just world. And that is a lot of ancient wisdom. And I've certainly had the experience of diving deep into text and being challenged. I think particularly on texts around criminal justice in Judaism, I remember when I discovered many years ago when I was starting to study text and criminal justice and realizing that there's no prison system in classical Jewish text. And when the idea of prison, and it's not like they didn't know about it, even the rabbis, it was just that was a non-Jewish thing. And even when prison starts to come up and be introduced into certain certain legal texts, it's seen as something that is still foreign, that is maybe a necessary evil, but foreign, right? And always coming at those questions of criminal justice, not from the assumption like we have in the United States that we have to lock people up, right? That's our first step, like just lock them up. And that we're starting from a position of let's punish people. And Judaism instead has this position of the goal is tshuva, and the goal is reintegration into society, and also that that once somebody has done whatever kind of reparation or whatever they need to do for the thing that they did, for the transgression they did, it's over, it's done. They don't continue to be punished, right? So those kinds of ideas that I do think bring new thinking and new perspectives onto how we think about contemporary issues. So when I study text, I'm not looking for confirmation for what I already think. I'm also looking to be challenged, and I'm looking for texts that are difficult or texts I don't understand or texts that bring a new insight. I talked about ritual because, as I said, social justice work is difficult and it's exhausting, and ritual can sustain us and can sustain our work. And there's also a lot of power in doing justice work in a community. And of course, people find lots of different communities to be part of, but I would say a religious community, a Jewish community, which could be through a synagogue, but it could be through your group of friends who you have Shabbat dinner with, but and then on Sunday you do justice work together, or your school or your JCC or whatever is your community. It means that is a place to live out that integrated sense of being Jewish, that we can have Shabbat dinner with the same people that we're then going and protesting with.
And I love how you're putting it, but I wonder, there might be times when the ritual actually doesn't serve as a balm. It makes it more difficult, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so but there may be a lot, and this maybe gets back to my God question, or a sense of larger obligation. There's a way in which those three strains that you mentioned could be of service, and you started to tap at this when you were speaking about text. And sometimes you enter a text and you're confronted with something,
yeah,
a way you weren't thinking before. Is there a way in which the religious piece of the work actually evolves the work itself, right? Like creates standards for you that you might not come up with on your own. And perhaps that could also happen in community. I mean, this can happen out in the world as well. But I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more what you mean? I'm just thinking of if there's an example.
Well, I think that there's a way in which we can take the tradition, as you started to say it, like to reaffirm what we already believe.
Right.
And then there's a different position by which we enter the religion saying, actually, the reason I'm here is because I don't know everything.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And if left to other people have said this more eloquently than I will, but if left to my own devices, I'll probably self-justify.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to be held to a higher something.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think about tzedakah as one of the best examples of this. I mean, Americans give on average 2% of our income in what the IRS would consider charitable deductions. Now, of course, in that number, we only know really people who itemize, or like it's not a perfect number, but that's the data that we have. And Judaism insists that we give 10%, and also puts really strict parameters on what counts as tzedakah. So for example, giving to an art museum doesn't count as tzedakah. Maybe if you give to a program for low-income kids to do art with that museum, that counts as tzedakah, or giving to your university. And really has developed the sense of what, like, there's lots and lots of conversations about what falls into tzedakah. So maybe giving wine for Kiddush to your shul doesn't count unless the people who need that wine are going to come and take it, right? Or donating books, unless it's people who need to borrow those books are going to come and use it. And that's just a much stricter sense of what it means to do, I mean, I'm going to say charity to use the English word, right? But it's just a much, or what the IRS would consider charities, like it's just a much stricter sense. And of course, the 10% number is much higher than the American, than when the American average is. And, you know, I'll say, of course, somebody who is not able, you know, you have to be able to feed yourself and house yourself and take care of your basic needs. So before you're giving the 10%. But for those of us who are fed and housed and have healthcare and like really basic needs, that 10% number is presents a challenge. And it also refocuses how we give. I'm going to give one, like really concretely how my family does this. But you know, tzedakah, as we know, comes from tzedek, justice. And the implication is that if the money happened to fall into my bank account, it's not actually mine. I have to figure out the just way to redistribute it to whoever it should go to. And so the way that my husband and I do it is we have automatic, you know, we just set up a whole bunch of accounts in our online checking account system. And so automatically when we get our direct deposit paycheck, 10% is automatically transferred to another account. And that makes it like we don't touch that until we're ready to give out the tzedakah, because we don't have to go into our regular account. It's just sitting there. It's completely separate. And, you know, like the college fund or, you know, something else. And then so when we sit down to do our tzedakah, it's like, okay, here's the money that we have to give out because that's been automatically transferred out. And then we have real discussions about, well, if we give to this organization, does that count as tzedakah money, or do we have to give to that organization separately because maybe we do want to support our university or our synagogue or something like that, but we're not going to take it out of our tzedakah money?
So I just want to make sure that the utilities in your town know that if they don't get paid this month, it's because you're doing tzedek, and it's important for them not to cut off the TV or the electricity or the plumbing. So
right. I mean, we're lucky in that way, and like I said, obviously people have to take care
it's
of
a beautiful
their
idea. It's a wonderful way to
needs.
do it. I love it. Noah and I are surveying the Jewish world, looking for people who are visionaries to help us understand what's coming. So we're going to give you a little gift. I'm going to give you a magic lamp. And I have a sense of what you would want for America and for Israel, for the world. But I'd like you to tell us for the Jewish world, for the Jewish community that we work in, that we came from, that we belong to. If Jill Jacobs is successful, what does that Jewish community look like tomorrow?
Thanks. That's an awesome question, and particularly as we're sitting in a kind of dark period where we're thinking about, God willing, what happens when we come out of this this current crisis. So I'll just say for the American Jewish community, which is just this context that I'm working in, I want us to have a community that has a really rich Jewish life where we're immersed in learning, where we're immersed in Torah, and where we're immersed in action. And as I started with, that we don't see any of those as separate, that we see that we have a responsibility to dig deep into our wisdom, to be a moral voice for the future. And of course, that we are out of that we're supporting human rights and hopefully succeeding in pursuing human rights for everybody around us and everybody in Israel and the occupied territories. And that we are really proudly Jewish and proudly American, and that we are able to, I don't know if I want to say integrate that, but live out all of our complexities as well as all of our other identities that we all have.
Beautiful vision. You know, amen, amen. And we also have a very important question that we close all our interviews with. Someone who is a very serious activist also must have a very well-developed sense of humor in order to be in it for as long as you have. Would love to know your favorite Jewish joke of the moment.
Well, I'll tell you one that gets reenacted in our house very often. So you've got there are four older, I don't know why it's always older Jewish men, but at least that's the way I learned this joke. So you've got four older Jewish men who are sitting around a park bench. And one of them says, "Oi, And the second one says, oy vey. And the third one says, oy vey, Izmir. And the fourth one says, if you three don't stop talking politics, I'm leaving.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
For the moment.
Perfect.
Well, Jill, thank you so very much for joining us, for being part of this conversation. And we'll leave. I think your oy vey it's a really heartfelt oy vey, and I think all of us feel the oy vey. And but we've also felt some of your passion and your vision and your wisdom today. So thank you so very much for sharing with us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
And everyone who's shared this with us tonight, thank you for being with us. And please tune in Wednesday nights and join us for the continuation of our exploration of Jewish life awakening. And thanks for being with us. Noah, good night. Thank you.